Thank you to Paul for making us run on a bunch of stairs after lunch to get here. But it will be worthwhile. It's called Investing in a Tier System for Release Architectures. Thank you.
Actually, it did work before.
That's of course worse than, well, it's worse if people want to contribute.
Can you have a brief introduction to the John's proposal first?
To the what?
A brief introduction to the John proposal.
I think we'll get to that. So, 1 second, please. I think I've seen some porters. Release team is at least me. Any FTP masters? No. And DSA? And we're gonna try and figure out all their problems by talking among us. Let's see how far we get. Seco is starting to write down who's here. That might be nice for later on. So maybe this is going to answer your question of what the or at least the current status is, and then we can come to part of the proposal. So as I understand, the infrastructure of ports currently is they're there. They run on, or they have an archive that runs unstable. Some of them sometimes create installer images when there's a release. They're there to do the initial porting, and currently once a port becomes a release architecture, the whole architecture is re-bootstrapped on DSA infrastructure. But then, of course, all the bugs should be gone, so that should be trivial. And currently, old architectures go to the ports as well for people that still want to run them. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I don't want to derail too far in other topics, how interesting they are. So I hope that we don't go into expectations on that this proposal magically fixes broken architectures. The porting still will need to be done by interesting parties. I mean, that's not the work of the whole project. And it's also not meant to shift burden if we have a tier 2 system, like say more than what we do now for the ports. So what this discussion I want it to be about is the idea of having multiple tiers, 2, 3, or maybe even more, and what those things would mean. I'd like to come up with, well, at least a first inventory of what things are would need change to be able to do this. One of the interesting questions is what would testing mean for those architectures, because I think that's one of the nice things that this proposal could actually bring us. And of course, after release, then you also have a stable for these architectures. Of course, even if it's an interesting idea, do we actually want this? And if we want this, are there enough people that want to actually work on it? Because like everything, if we want it and nobody works on it, we're not going to get it. At the end, I do volunteer for support in Brittany, but I'm not really supporting or dedicated my time already for other things. So the rest of the stuff is open for discussion. So I'll go down through a couple of things that I already wrote down. If you don't agree with the stuff that I read down or want to make nuances or comments, I propose that here the discussion starts. It's mostly a brain dump of what I thought of, a bit of the discussion on the ports ISC channel. So let's go to it. Please feel free to interrupt at any time. I mean, it's a POF. The other mic is over there.
So I would like to add something where Tier 1 and Tier 2 architectures interact with each other. And that would be for example, for cross-compilers, where you have some target as a Tier 2 and some target as a Tier 1, and how we want to handle that.
Fair point. I don't have an answer. Anybody? Any idea? I'll take it from the recording later on, but add it to the ideas we need to figure out. So in my current write-down, I have Tier 1 is quite much like the current release architectures. The next line is a bit bad sentence in what I mean, but I couldn't get up with much better. Currently, maintainers are expected to have a view of what happens on the other architectures, although architecture-specific issues, there's architecture-specific porters. And that's why we do, from the release team, the porter call. So maintainers and/or architectures are expected to fix issues on the Tier 1 architectures, like now on the release architectures. And as I said before, to not burden maintainers more with the higher tiers, no additional things are expected, I would say, similar like the current ports. So in that sense, this is reflecting very much like we currently have for ports. Now here it may become a bit more interesting because, of course, if they're more expected to know of each other, we need to think of how they interact with each other. Toko just mentioned one point. The next point is more about how issues would influence each other. And this is just what I would come up with. So, being a Tier 2, it shouldn't influence the migration on Tier 1. So in my head, that would mean that the migration rules for packages are similar on release architectures as they are now. And of course, the next topic is, of course, how do these migration rules look like? But opposite from that, so if there's issues on Tier 2 architectures, they will not mean auto removal of your package. That's part of being Tier 2. On the opposite, Tier 2 specific issues, therefore, cannot be higher severity than important, because that would cause auto removal. And the idea, of course, is that tier 1 keeps the quality that it has, that we currently have on the release architectures, or better, of course. Don't aim for the status quo. Well, that's what I said. I'm going to stop here for a second. Comments, welcome.
So, of course, you'll need to keep at least old versions of source packages and binary old packages around potentially for a long time if you've had migrations happened in tier 2, tier 3, and then newer versions don't work. Is that likely to cause us problems?
The problem we have at the moment with the ports architectures is that the system isn't even running DAC, but mini DAC, and that is decrafting packages immediately. So, right, the opposite of what Sledge just asked, what should be done, and that causes a lot of problems with bootstrapping and stuff. So, yeah, we would have to start by getting a reasonable archive software installed there. And of course it would probably be easier to host this in the main DAC installation. But yeah, that's the question, if FTP master is willing to do that, and if not, we need a better syncing mechanism that doesn't throw away stuff all the time.
If we are to move everything to the normal DAC installation, it means that effectively we will have everything in the mirrors, probably. And then, have you evaluated the size of all the architectures that are not release architecture? Will it double the size of our binaries? No, I was just thinking about size and mirroring. We probably would need to announce that so that people who do mirroring have enough space.
Well, maybe the mirrors could opt in for tier 1 only or for all tiers.
Then that would mean probably adding such an option in FTP sync.
On the sync side there, your problem is going to be the multiple source packages, right? You can easily exclude the tier 2 architectures, but because you're going to have multiple versions of the source around to handle those versions that haven't transitioned, I'm not clear with the present system how you could exclude that from a mirror easily, right? The rsync doesn't have any visibility to the metadata. So you're going to end up with quite potentially very large collections of source depending on just how out of sync the tier 2 architectures and potentially lower tiers get.
How about source packages that only build binary packages on tier 2 architectures? So if you'd upload them, they would be building no packages for any tier 1 architectures, and possibly imagine they would be rejected.
The current workaround for that is to have some architecture all package in there.
Described was a source that's only needed on a tier 2. Yeah.
Is it somehow agreed that the port should gain a testing pocket, or is it?
It was a proposal, but by all means, I think it could be just unstable as well. But I think at least a couple of the things that we identified that would be worthwhile to work on, like the DAC changes to keep things more in sync, and the Brittany changes for the migration would not be needed, of course, if you don't do that. But
So one, well, maybe not a real world problem, but for example, we didn't have, for example, OpenJDK not working on some of the ports architectures. I mean, it is cross-buildable, even the package, but you were not able to install it because you had many mismatching bin NMU versions in unstable. So to install the build dependencies for cross-build, you had to rebuild everything and cheat, and well, until you had the first cross-compiled package. So how do you keep these version numbers in sync? I think in unstable it's impossible. When the ports are doing their own transitions. So you would need to have some testing where you have matching versions of packages.
yeah, so maybe that we then already come to a couple of ideas that I dropped here for what testing could mean. For one of the reasons why I was interested in this proposal is particular for the release team, the architecture qualification. I think if we had tier 1 and 2 or T2 set up, it would become, well, hopefully, at least that would be my wish out of this change, easier to get a tier 1 to tier 2 or tier 2 to tier 1. So for me, that would mean that you need a testing. But integers are infinite, so we can also maybe add a tier 3. I don't know, I had another idea why a tier 3 may be worthwhile, so maybe we can expand the amount and have different classes of tiers than just the 2 that were raised earlier. Some of the ideas about testing, they're not all ors and they're not all ands, so they're just a couple of ideas here. I think it's logical to make sure that tier 2 is never ahead of tier 1. That could be all that we enforce, or it could be something smarter along the line, but I think this is like the base minimum. Another option could be to keep tier 2 in sync, I think per arc, because otherwise all the tier 2 need to be in sync, and I think that is probably not going to work. And a way to keep it in sync is by removing packages that go out of sync. I think that probably is a bit too harsh and that doesn't work, but could be an idea. You could lower that by X amount of time, and or when they get into the way of other migrations, just to soften it a bit. Obviously, I think we need to make exceptions for the base set, that you can actually run the system on testing, because otherwise it's completely worthless. Yeah, another idea is keep it in sync as much as possible, but if there's already a package in testing and you would have to remove it, then just keep the package in testing. That's, I think, probably gonna age the archive a bit too much, so I'm not sure that that's a good idea. probably orthogonal to this, I vision.
An idea could be enabling architecture-specific build profiles on Tier 2 architectures to have them opt out of specific features like large package ecosystems and having them removed by build profiles. So the individual architecture could select or deselect certain features and thereby support less than Tier 1 architectures.
How would that help?
Well, less work for porters.
It of course would defeat my purpose a bit of being able to quickly move from Tier 2 to Tier 1. But I
Yes,
guess
of course.
that may be an idea then again for a flavor of Tier 3.
Maybe we could differentiate Tier 2 a little bit, because I think you would never expect, Adrian, M68K becoming a Tier 1 architecture again. So maybe have a Tier 2 for architectures where you may expect that they move to Tier 1, and have a Tier 3 for, well, historic architectures. And for example, I think Adrian currently has even disabled tests for, I think, the SH4 port and maybe the M68K port. So he builds, but he doesn't test. And that would be something that, well, you could do for Tier 3 as well, but which you should not do for Tier 2.
And of course, for moving from Tier 3 to Tier 2, you'd also need to be able to trigger a complete archive rebuild because you don't trust the binaries from Tier 3.
That, of course, depends on the rules that we set around Tier 3,
Sure.
but indeed somewhere where we go from random archive to DSA maintained
Exactly.
archive, that's indeed where,
Just saying, of course, that's what we've done in the past when we've bootstrapped new architectures. You know,
Yeah,
it's important.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned here at the top. When the porting work is done, then it's rebootstrapped on DSA hardware. Anybody else already has comments? I have more notes so I can go through, but it's above, so please.
For the testing part, I think it has to be completely automated, or at least to be able to run completely automated, because porter time is already limited, and I don't think people would want to maintain testing handhold like the release team does with transitions and stuff for each architecture individually. So it should be meant to run unattendedly, mostly.
Archive didn't come up in my mind.
Yeah, so just syncing everything or keeping versions in sync with the main testing and migrating as soon as it migrates in the main Tier 1 architecture archive would probably make sense. Yeah, of course, manual intervention should be possible, but should not be required on a daily basis.
Of course, I completely forgot to mention that I envision this all to be implemented by Brittany, and that's actually the part that I offer to contribute.
Yeah. How much of testing would survive if you wouldn't be hinting anything? How much of the main archive Tier 1 Brittany stuff would be working if you stopped hinting now?
I don't think we hint that much. I mean, I think most of the hints are actually around auto-package tests, constructions, and I consider that more or less a bug in Brittany, where it can't figure out all the combination that I'd like to figure out, and where we just decide, well, either this is caused by something else, or just glibc always triggers all kind of flaky tests, and once you've checked them, you just say, well, this is indeed just okay and flaky and should move on. Yeah. And then instead of making sure that at any one moment in time where Brittany would migrate the stuff, it's unflaky, we use these kind of hits.
I guess we would have to just experiment with trying it to see how much of that just runs automatically and how much of that we should be ignoring just to avoid the workload on people.
Yeah, but what I meant to write down here, I haven't spoken them up, but I think it's smart that the porters at least have hint capabilities to fix issues that are only tier 2 or tier 3 or whatever, how many we get, are related outside of the release team. That's what I mostly wanted to say here, not indeed to do manual syncing, but just to fix issues. There was a question on IRC.
Yeah, Miko is suggesting that we keep tier 3 for rapid development arcs and tier 4 for old arcs. I'm probably meaning arcs like M68K.
Should we have minimal requirements for every tier? So, for example, I think Johannes Schauer, so maybe Helmut knows about that, he tried to define a minimal set of packages that are needed to build the core. So, I mean, even a tier 2 architecture should be able to do that. Without testing, but so that you have something workable.
Sounds sane.
As it stands now, it's actually architecture dependent due to some architectures opting out of some features already. And if you go the strict, just select everything for central generatively, we end up with Haskell, right? So every architecture needs Haskell. I'm not sure we really want that.
Well, you could define that we don't need.
Doko said you know what. What was your comment, Doko? What was your comment?
Well, you could say, well, we enable certain profiles on some architectures, like no Java or no Haskell or something like that.
And I think that could work in a tier 3 or tier 4 or whatever we define, but I think I would not want it in tier 2, but that could be a boundary between tier 2 and something higher.
So now we are defining partial archives.
Maybe.
Partial ports.
I'd like to go over some of the notes that I wrote for the Brittany and Dark have been mentioned. If we have stuff missing, it would be great to add them. In the stuff that we discussed above, Brittany would need, of course, awareness of these things. I think we, as I said, I was not envisioning a manual testing support, so Brittany, and that's, of course, a design choice of one instance or a instance per tier 2 port or something common. I haven't really thought about that, but at least they need to be aware of each other to make sure that tier 2 is not ahead of tier 1. But indeed, if multiple things, it's maybe only needed one directional. Removal hints currently work across the board, so we need to fix that. And a thing that I just don't know, and I would need to figure out if Brittany is allowed even to remove per arc. Currently, we don't even do that in the release team, so I have no idea if we can actually do it. And of course, I think it's, as a release team member, I don't want the ports to interfere with tier 1, so that would need a separation somehow. On the area of DAC, I understand indeed that mini DAC isn't allowing for testing and has the problem with gruffing, so we'd want to have a DAC that works for tier 2. Also there, open issue if that's one instance or if that is multiple instances across the architectures. If it's multiple, there needs to be some synchronization, of course, of overrides and handling of thruft. And one item that came up on IRC was binaries that have different names. I think you mentioned that earlier in this talk as well. Oh, that was more for the source. This was for the binaries, which probably have a similar issue, where, if I understand correctly, currently those binaries would end up in the new queue of the ports team instead of the FTP team. So we need to figure out how to handle that. In the original proposal of Adrian, he already mentioned that probably DSA was the biggest thing that would stand in the way of such a proposal. So that's obviously a question how to handle that. Currently, DSA is responsible for the maintenance of the servers that build our packages, which would be equal for tier 1. And then the question is, of course, how to handle the buildies for tier 2 and or 3, etc. So I don't know, I haven't spoken to them yet. I was hoping for representatives of them here to see what this would mean. So I think we'll just need to take this to them. I could imagine that some of the architectures are far enough that DSA could already take hardware. And then that could be a split between 2 and 3 where DSA says, well, this is good enough and we can support it. And then you can be a tier 2, and if DSA says no, then you cannot be more than 3. As an example. I don't know if this would work, but that's currently what I had in mind. That could be an option. Of course, if DSA says, well, we can handle it anyway, which I don't think they'll do, then this is no big deal. Any comments on that? Ideas, prediction towards what DSA will say? Then another thing that I thought of, although I think it's really below at the end of the list, of course the BTS could gain support for the different tiers such that you could handle auto removal in tier 2 in a BTS supported way, similar like we now do with RC bugs on release architectures. This was all discussed. So I think we're mostly down to the questions. Do we like the idea potentially a lot or just a tiny bit? Are there people that want to work on it, or am I the only one volunteering so far?
So I listed what we need volunteering for. I'm not sure I missed some. If I did, please write on.
Do we want to mandate auto package test runners for tier 1 architectures? And if so, is this an ultimatum on MIPS?
Regarding the BTS, I think are there user tags for ports at the moment?
What was the question?
Regarding BTS handling for RC in ports, I think the BTS doesn't have architecture tags. I think there may be user tags for some of the ports. I'm not sure about that. It seems like we would want to formalize that.
I think currently bugs should not be RC if it's only architecture specific for a port. And I think that should remain the same for tier 2 in the proposal as I wrote it earlier.
RC for tier 2, as in it would be...
Yeah, so that would be a new thing of how to define that. And I think, yeah. I haven't thought of it, but that could be a new tag or...
Right. I feel like we would actually want to have tag bugged by architecture, and we don't have that as a core thing at the moment.
Yeah, I think I think it would be a good idea to talk with the BTS maintainers what they think is the best way to implement that. I could imagine just a tag like we currently have for ignoring RC bugs. You could also say, well, this is an RC bug only for tier 2, or the opposite. This is tagged, it's an important bug, and then the tag is RC for architecture X or something. I mean, I'm just dreaming it up now.
So we are talking for 35 minutes about that. Maybe we should use the rest of the time to see how we continue, because half of the teams are not here. And looking at past DebConfs, these teams were not attending either. So how can we solve or address that? And going on.
Well, I for sure feel that people like it. Maybe that's the good question. Who thinks we shouldn't do this? Sorry, I asked who shouldn't. So maybe that's the bad, because I was expecting a lot of hands, I asked the opposite. So let's try it again. Who thinks we should not do this? Okay, so I'll try to see if I can find more volunteers for the other topics. Again, I volunteer for Brittany, but I'll not be looking at DAC. So somebody else needs to do that. Obviously, that's owned by a team that's not here, so I'll not force it upon them, but if anybody wants to work on it.
I got to ask a question. It might be a stupid question, but I haven't heard clearly articulated what the benefit is. I can see a couple of things that might come out of this. The two things I can potentially see is, one, it brings Debian ports into the fold a bit better, and the other is it maybe makes it easier to bootstrap a new architecture. But are those the use cases you're seeing for the separate tiers, or what's the ultimate benefit to the project all of this work ends up with?
For me, as a release team manager, I've seen the architecture qualification, the last 3 releases, as a rather mental heavy thing. I mean, I don't want to kick architectures out. I'm not extremely versed in well, what it means to run an architecture. So I sort of feel like I'm really one eye in the land of the blind, well, not in the land of 2 eyes, so I feel handicapped in that sense. I think, or that's my hope, that having a tier 2, tier 1, tier 2 and multiple system, it would be less severe if you would go from tier 1 to tier 2, and opposite it would, but that's then less of my incentive, that it obviously makes it easier for tier 2 to tier 1. Ideally, it would just be a switch in the configuration of Brittany. I mean, that would my wet dream be, but
So in the past, I think for the past 3 or 4 Debian releases, release team, we really didn't have any release architecture qualification. And so the gap between a release architecture and a port is just too big. I mean, you cannot, for example, compare K3BSD to RISC 564. And for whatever reason, these decisions were not made. So you are trying to be inclusive, you are trying to help a port, something like that, but at some point you have to say, well, maybe it's not over, but we want to point to you that you have to change something. And currently for i386, maybe it shouldn't be a release architecture anymore, but it could be a Tier 2 architecture. I think with that it would help to differentiate a bit. And on the other hand, well, porting for new architectures or porting software for old architectures is currently just painful, and having these packages in sync in testing would help a lot.
so obviously it also helps as a service for the ports that they can actually offer something like a stable release in the end, because if you had the testing at release time, that's actually there. And I've heard some porters really say that that would be appreciated, and this would also enable that.
Yeah, so this seems like a really cool idea. I like it a lot. Good luck finding volunteers to help with all the work that's needed, of course. That's always our problem. This could make absolutely a really big difference on getting new architectures in, and also, as you say, making it less painful to drop an old architecture. I'm about to propose in my next talk that we drop i386 as well, just to, to back that up.
So I've been following the PowerPC architecture, the 32-bit one, for a little bit now. I actually only got mine after it was dropped from Debian, as these things work. Currently, if you want to install on 32-bit PowerPC, there's one very specific day where Adrian managed to actually create a fully working install CD. And so install from that specific day, and then where grub works and the install works and the partitioner works and formatting the hard drive works and everything just actually works. And then after that, it's back to pieces are missing or patches get unapplied or things like that. And also seen other things where go to install a desktop environment and might be wait a couple of days for pieces to filter in and filter out and see when everything's actually available. So not a lot of users, but if things don't get taken out or get migrated as groups, then you have a better chance of actually keeping things installable.
So, well, PowerPC is actually the reason why I am here too. Asking for volunteers, yes, it had been mentioned already. Point is, I see a bit of disalignment between, well, I'm fascinated how many people came here to see this. And at the same time, I see in IRC somewhere that several architectures have at most one porter at this very moment. So, well, all I can say is, please, if you're interested in a particular architecture, please sign up for the porter work to get things done.
And with that, we're out of time. So I suggest you organize a sprint and get everyone together. Now that COVID is less of an issue, it might be possible. And then that helps getting it going for getting it bootstrapped further. And thanks for organizing the session, and thanks for all the great work that the release team does. We all appreciate it.